Zenobia of Palmyra. Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back into the quieter corners of royal history. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the day become someone else's problem for a while. Because tonight we're looking at queens who lost. Not queens who retired gracefully after decades of ruling, not queens who handed over the crown with a tasteful little speech and moved somewhere sunny. We mean queens who were defeated. Queens whose armies disappeared, whose palaces were occupied, whose titles suddenly became rather theoretical, and whose enemies had to decide what to do with a woman who had once been treated as the most important person in the room. And that last part could be surprisingly complicated. A king who was captured was a political problem. A queen who was captured was often a political problem with jewelry. She could be imprisoned, she could be exiled, she could be married off, she could be sent to a convent, she could be executed, or occasionally she could be allowed to live in comfortable retirement, which was about as close as medieval politics came to admitting that perhaps everyone had been a little dramatic. So, let's begin with one of the most fascinating examples, Zenobia of Palmyra. She lived in the 3rd century during one of the more chaotic periods of the Roman Empire. And when I say chaotic, I mean that Rome was having the sort of century where emperors appeared, disappeared, were murdered, were replaced, and were sometimes murdered by the people who had just replaced them. It was not a relaxing administrative environment. Zenobia ruled the wealthy city of Palmyra in Syria. Palmyra sat in an extremely useful position between the Roman world and the Persian Empire. Trade passed through the region, caravans passed through, money passed through. Naturally, everyone wanted a piece of it. Zenobia became ruler after the death of her husband Odenathus around the year 267. Her young son, Vaballathus, inherited his father's position. Zenobia, meanwhile, became the real power behind the throne, and she was very good at it. At first, Palmyra remained associated with Rome. This was important. Zenobia did not wake up one morning and announce that she had decided to become the enemy of the Roman Empire. Things developed more gradually. Rome was struggling with invasions and internal instability. Zenobia took advantage of that weakness. Her forces expanded into Egypt. They moved into parts of Asia Minor. Palmyrene authority spread across a large section of the Eastern Roman world. And Zenobia began presenting herself not merely as the mother of a local ruler, but as a sovereign in her own right. Coins were minted in the name of her son. Titles became more ambitious. The relationship with Rome became increasingly awkward. It was the ancient equivalent of changing your relationship status while still technically sharing the same Netflix account. Eventually, Rome had had enough. The Emperor Aurelian marched east, and Aurelian was not particularly interested in negotiating with Zenobia as an equal. He wanted the eastern territories back. Zenobia had other plans. The two sides met in battle. Palmyrene forces were defeated. Zenobia withdrew towards Palmyra. Aurelian followed. The city was besieged. And this is where Zenobia's story becomes especially interesting, because we know much more about her defeat than we know about the exact details of her later life. Ancient writers had plenty to say about the dramatic part. They were less reliable about the paperwork afterwards. Eventually, Zenobia fled Palmyra. She headed towards the Euphrates, apparently hoping to reach Persian territory. But Roman forces caught her. She was taken prisoner, and now the question was simple. What do you do with a captured queen? Aurelian had a problem. If he killed her, she could become a martyr. If he released her, she might become a rallying point for another rebellion. If he kept her in prison, he had to decide where. And if he simply ignored her, that would be difficult because she had spent several years behaving as though the Roman Empire was an optional suggestion.
So Aurelian chose something more theatrical. He took Zenobia to Rome. The emperor celebrated a triumph. Triumphs were enormous public spectacles in which Rome displayed the people and treasures it had defeated, and Zenobia was apparently part of the procession. Later Roman sources describe her being displayed in golden chains. The imagery was carefully designed. Here was the proud queen, here was the Eastern ruler who had challenged Rome, and here she was, walking behind the emperor. It was political theatre. Rome was saying very calmly and very publicly that the problem had been solved. Please stop worrying. The interesting thing is what happened next, because Zenobia did not appear to be executed. Instead, she seems to have survived. Ancient sources disagree on some of the details. One tradition says that Aurelian allowed her to live in comfortable circumstances. She may have been given property at Tiber near Rome. She may have married again. Her children may have entered respectable Roman society. And this is where the story becomes almost oddly peaceful. A woman who had recently controlled a large part of the Eastern Roman Empire may have ended her days living as a wealthy Roman noblewoman, which is a rather strange ending. Imagine spending years building empire, fighting Rome, losing your capital, being marched through the streets of the imperial capital in a triumph, and then eventually settling into a nice villa. History occasionally has the pacing of a very long property management dispute. We should also be careful with the popular image of Zenobia. Later writers transformed her into almost a legendary warrior queen. She was described as beautiful, brilliant, physically hardy, intellectually formidable, and deeply ambitious. Some accounts even emphasized her supposed endurance and ability to travel long distances on horseback. There is probably some truth buried beneath the literary decoration, but ancient historians liked exceptional women in much the same way modern audiences do. If a woman became powerful, writers tended to explain her. She was unusually beautiful, she was unusually masculine, she was unusually intelligent, she had an unusually complicated personality. Apparently, simply being competent was not enough. Zenobia's intelligence was often emphasized because it helped explain how she could possibly have achieved what she did, and she really had achieved a lot. She inherited a precarious political position. She maintained control over a wealthy city. She expanded Palmyrene authority. She challenged Rome during a period when Rome was vulnerable. And for several years it worked. Then it didn't. That was the basic problem with being an ambitious queen in the ancient world. Success could be enormous. Failure could be equally enormous. And there was very little middle ground. If you lost a minor border dispute, perhaps you paid an indemnity. If you lost a war while claiming imperial authority, you could find yourself being displayed in chains in someone else's capital. Naturally, this made royal women very careful, or at least it should have. Zenobia's fate also reveals something important about defeated queens. They were not always killed because they were valuable alive. A live queen could be used as proof of victory. She could be displayed. She could be negotiated over. She could be married off into another family. She could be kept under supervision. And sometimes she could simply disappear into a comfortable life far away from politics. The crown itself could be taken away. The person wearing it did not necessarily have to die with it. This was especially true when the conqueror had already demonstrated his power. Aurelian did not need Zenobia's death to prove that he had defeated her. He had taken Palmyra. He had defeated her armies. He had brought her to Rome. The message was already understood. So perhaps there was no reason to make the ending uglier than necessary. Zenobia's later life is uncertain enough that we should resist giving her a neat fairy tale ending. We don't know exactly how long she lived. We don't know precisely where she lived. We don't even know with certainty whether every detail repeated by later historians is accurate. but the broad outline is remarkably clear. She lost her kingdom, she became a prisoner, she was taken to Rome, and she survived. For a queen who had once challenged the Roman Empire, survival itself was not an insignificant achievement, and perhaps that is the first lesson of our little tour through defeated queens. Losing the crown did not always mean losing everything. Sometimes the former queen became a prisoner, sometimes a widow, sometimes a religious recluse, sometimes a political bargaining chip, and sometimes, rather unexpectedly, she became a wealthy woman living quietly in the Roman countryside, while the empire she had once challenged continued doing what empires do, which was mostly arguing with itself. So let's leave Zenobia for a moment. Her story gives us our first version of the defeated queen.
Mary, Queen of Scots, would have considerably less peace, and that is putting it mildly. If Zenobia's story ended with the strange possibility of a comfortable retirement, Mary's story went in the opposite direction. She lost her throne, she fled her country, she asked another queen for help, and that other queen, Elizabeth I of England, eventually decided that the safest way to help her was to keep her under guard for nearly 19 years, which was probably not quite what Mary had in mind. Mary Stuart was born in 1542. She became Queen of Scotland when she was only 6 days old. So technically, Mary had been queen for almost her entire life. She did not have a childhood in which someone sat her down and explained that perhaps monarchy was a little demanding. She simply grew up knowing that she was the queen. And there was another complication. Mary had a claim to English throne. She was a great-granddaughter of Henry VII. This meant that from the perspective of many Catholics, Mary's claim to England was perfectly serious. Unfortunately for Mary, England already had a queen, Elizabeth, and Elizabeth had no particular desire to hand over her crown. So the two women were related. They were both queens. They were both extremely aware of the importance of succession, and they spent much of their lives never meeting in person. This is one of those situations where a family reunion probably would not have been particularly relaxing. Mary spent much of her childhood in France. She was raised at the French court and married Francis, the heir to the French throne. When Francis became king, Mary briefly found herself Queen Consort of France, as well as Queen of Scotland. For a young woman who had already been queen since infancy, this was quite a respectable collection of titles. But then Francis died. Suddenly, Mary was a young widow. She returned to Scotland in 1561, and Scotland was not the same world she had known in France. It was increasingly Protestant. Mary was Catholic. The country had powerful nobles. Religious tensions were everywhere, and the Queen had to govern a kingdom where many of the people around her had their own ideas about how the kingdom should be governed. This was not ideal, but Mary managed for several years. Then came her marriage to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Darnley was Mary's cousin, and naturally royal families had always been enthusiastic about marrying relatives. It was considered useful for keeping property, titles, and succession claims within the family. Genetics was less in the conversation. The marriage began badly and became worse. Darnley wanted power. Mary was reluctant to give him as much as he wanted. He became jealous and resentful. And then, in 1566, one of the more unpleasant episodes of Mary's reign took place. Mary's secretary, David Rizzio, was murdered in her presence. Darnley and a group of conspirators entered the Queen's supper chamber. Mary was heavily pregnant. Rizzio was dragged away and stabbed. It was an extraordinary act of violence inside the royal household, and it left Mary in an increasingly dangerous political position. A few months later, Mary gave birth to a son. His name was James, and this child would eventually become one of the most important monarchs in British history. But his birth did not repair the marriage. Darnley remained unpopular, and in February 1567 he was murdered. His body was found at Kirko Field, outside Edinburgh. There was an explosion, there were questions, there were rumours, and because this was a 16th century royal marriage, there was no shortage of people who were willing to assume that the Queen must somehow be involved. The person most widely suspected of arranging the murder was James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. And then Mary made a decision that would haunt her. She married him, only 3 months after Darnley's death. It was an extraordinary political mistake. Even if Mary herself had not participated in Darnley's murder, marrying the man widely believed to have been responsible made the whole situation look considerably worse. It was the sort of decision that made historians centuries later stare quietly at the page. Naturally, Mary's enemies were delighted. The Scottish nobles rebelled. Mary and Bothwell gathered their forces. The two sides met at Carbery Hill. Mary's position collapsed. She surrendered, and this was the moment when the Queen, who had ruled Scotland since infancy, lost control of her kingdom. She was taken to Lochleven Castle. There she was forced to abdicate in favour of her infant son. James became king. He was still a baby. Mary was still a young woman, and suddenly Scotland had a new king who could not speak, walk properly, or have an opinion about taxation. It was not exactly a normal transfer of power. Mary was now a former queen, and former queens could be very inconvenient, especially former queens who still believed they were the rightful monarch. For a while Mary remained at Lochleven. The castle was built on an island. Water surrounded it. The location made escape difficult, but Mary was not entirely helpless. Eventually she found supporters, and in 1568 she escaped. There are several stories surrounding the escape. Mary reportedly gained access to the keys. She managed to leave the castle, and once outside she gathered supporters around her. For a brief moment it looked like she might recover her throne. She raised an army, but the opportunity lasted only a short time. Her forces were defeated at the Battle of Langside. And now Mary had a choice: stay in Scotland and risk capture, or leave. So she fled south, toward England. And this is where the story becomes almost painfully ironic. Mary was going to Elizabeth. She believed her fellow queen would help her. Elizabeth was also a woman. Elizabeth was also a monarch. Elizabeth understood what it meant to be threatened by powerful men, and importantly, Elizabeth herself had not been unfamiliar with imprisonment. So Mary probably imagined that Elizabeth would sympathize. She crossed the Solway Frith and entered England in 1568. She was expecting protection. Instead, she was placed under armed guard. Technically, Mary had not initially arrived as a convicted criminal. Her legal position was awkward. She had entered England voluntarily. She was a sovereign queen asking another sovereign queen for assistance. But Elizabeth had a problem. Mary was Catholic. Mary had a claim to the English throne, and there were English Catholics who believed Mary should replace Elizabeth. That made Mary dangerous. Even if Mary did absolutely nothing, she was still a potential symbol around which Elizabeth's enemies could gather, and Elizabeth understood this very well. So Mary became a guest, then a guarded guest, then gradually a prisoner. The distinction mattered. It allowed everyone to maintain the polite language of diplomacy. Mary was not supposed to be locked away in some miserable dungeon. She was a queen. She had servants. She had clothing. She had a household. She could receive visitors. She could write. She could even ride.
At Carlisle Castle, her English custodian, Sir Francis Knowles, was responsible for keeping an eye on Mary, and Mary apparently made quite an impression. She spoke freely, she could be charming, she enjoyed conversation, she liked horseback riding, she also liked hunting. This caused Knowles a slight problem, because Mary was a prisoner, and prisoners who galloped away on horseback were generally considered to be missing, so he eventually restricted her riding. He allowed her to walk outside the castle. That area later became known as Ladies' Walk. Mary also had her own clothes brought from Scotland. She refused to dress in whatever happened to be available locally. This was understandable. Royal identity depended heavily on appearances. A queen could be imprisoned without necessarily becoming ordinary. And Mary's household remained expensive. Her clothing, servants, food, horses, and other necessities had to be paid for. Elizabeth's government covered much of the cost. At Carlisle, the English crown reportedly spent an average of about £56 a week on provisions for Mary's household. This included food, spices, wine, heating fuel, and other necessities, which is rather a lot to spend on someone you are technically trying to prevent from becoming Queen of England. But royal captivity had its own etiquette. You couldn't simply put a queen in a bare cell and expect international politics to remain calm. So Mary's captivity had an unusual character. She was watched, she was restricted, she could not simply walk away, but she also had servants and comforts. She continued to dress like a queen, she continued to behave like a queen.
Empress Matilda. If Mary, Queen of Scots, discovered that losing a throne could turn a royal life into a long imprisonment, Matilda discovered something slightly different. Sometimes, losing a throne meant that you had to spend years trying to get it back. And sometimes, the person standing between you and your crown was a man who had promised your father that he would support you. Naturally, this did not make the family gatherings any easier. Matilda was born around 1102. She was the daughter of King Henry I of England, and Henry had a problem. He only had one legitimate surviving son. That son was William Adelin, and William was supposed to inherit the kingdom. Then, in 1120, disaster arrived in the form of a ship. The ship was called the White Ship. It carried William and a large group of young nobles across the English Channel. There was drinking, there was celebration, there was the confidence that tends to appear when everyone involved is young, wealthy, and fairly certain that the future belongs to them. The ship sank. William died. And suddenly, Henry I had no legitimate male heir. This was not a minor inconvenience. For a medieval king, succession was practically the entire point of having children. Henry had several illegitimate children. He had daughters, he had nobles, he had land. What he did not have was a convenient son waiting in the wings. So Henry turned to Matilda. Matilda was already a widow. She had been married to the German Emperor Henry V. The marriage was politically useful. She had spent years in Germany and had even acted as regent there while her husband was away. She therefore had something that many medieval queens did not: experience. Matilda had seen government from the inside. She had participated in royal administration. She understood court politics, and after Henry V died, she returned to England. Her father eventually decided that Matilda would be her heir. He made the English barons swear oaths to support her succession. This happened more than once. That detail is worth remembering, because later, several of the men who had sworn to support Matilda discovered that medieval oaths were apparently flexible when political circumstances became inconvenient. Henry I died in 1335. Matilda was not in England at the time, and another man was, her cousin, Stephen of Blois. Stephen was the son of Henry's sister. He was also a powerful nobleman, and perhaps most importantly, he was already in England.
So when Henry died, Stephen moved quickly. He crossed the Channel, he went to London, he secured support, he was crowned king, and Matilda's inheritance had effectively been taken from her. Now, medieval historians have spent a long time debating why Stephen was able to do this. There were political pressures, there were questions about whether a woman could rule, there were nobles who preferred Stephen. There were also nobles who had simply decided that supporting the person who was physically present was probably safer than waiting around for Matilda to arrive. This was medieval politics. You did not necessarily support the person with the strongest legal argument. You supported the person whose army was nearby. Matilda was furious, and understandably so. She had not been raised to think of herself as someone's decorative relative. She believed the kingdom was hers, so she began fighting for it. The conflict that followed became known as the Anarchy. The name is slightly dramatic, but not entirely inaccurate. England was divided between supporters of Stephen and supporters of Matilda. Castles changed hands, nobles changed sides, sieges became common, and the country suffered. Matilda eventually established herself in the west of England. She had support from powerful figures, including her half-brother Robert of Gloucester. She also had another important supporter, her husband, Geoffrey of Anjou. Their marriage was not particularly romantic. It was a political arrangement. Geoffrey was younger than Matilda. He was also determined to expand his influence. They had children. Their eldest surviving son was Henry, and this child would eventually become the key to the entire struggle. But Matilda wanted the throne for herself. She did not simply want to make her son king. She wanted to be queen. And this is where things became difficult. Matilda was not always an easy person to deal with. She could be forceful, she could be demanding, she expected obedience. And medieval chroniclers, many of whom were not especially enthusiastic about powerful women, were happy to describe her as proud. There is probably some truth to the impression that Matilda had a strong personality, but we should also remember that a medieval man who insisted on his rights was often called determined. A medieval woman who did the same thing could be called arrogant. History has always had its little preferences. In 1141, Matilda's position improved dramatically. Stephen was captured at the Battle of Lincoln. He was taken prisoner, and suddenly the King of England was sitting in a cell while Matilda was preparing to enter London. For a brief moment, it looked like she had won. This is one of the most remarkable moments of her life. Matilda entered London. She was preparing to be recognized as ruler. The royal administration was being reorganized. Her supporters expected the conflict to end. But Matilda had a problem. She needed London's support, and she was not particularly good at winning over the city's population. She demanded financial concessions. She behaved like a ruler who expected obedience. The Londoners were not impressed. There were disturbances. Support for her collapsed, and Matilda was forced to leave. She had come so close, and then, almost immediately, the city turned against her. It's one of those moments where medieval history feels less like a grand epic and more like a very expensive misunderstanding. Matilda's supporters continued fighting. Stephen was eventually released, and the war went on. The conflict dragged through the 1940s. Neither side could secure a decisive victory. Castles were built, castles were besieged, crops were damaged, towns suffered, and ordinary people had the unfortunate experience of living in a kingdom where powerful nobles were having an argument about inheritance. Matilda herself spent much of this period moving between strongholds. She had to remain politically active, she had to maintain alliances, she had to negotiate, she had to survive, and she had to keep her claim alive. At one point, she was famously trapped at Oxford Castle. Stephen's forces surrounded the castle. The situation became desperate. The traditional story says that Matilda escaped during winter by wearing white clothing and crossing the frozen landscape at night. The snow and ice supposedly concealed her from the besieging army. It's a wonderfully dramatic story, and medieval writers certainly enjoyed it.
Whether every detail happened exactly as later accounts describe is harder to establish, but Matilda did escape, and that was enough. She continued the struggle. Meanwhile, her son Henry was growing older. This was important. Henry was no longer a helpless child. He was becoming a political figure. He had inherited her claim, and he had his father's lands in Normandy and Anjou. By the 1550s, the question was changing. Could Matilda eventually become queen, or would her son eventually take the throne? Matilda's personal ambition had never disappeared, but politics had become more complicated. She had spent years fighting Stephen. Stephen had spent years defending his crown. Neither side had achieved everything they wanted, and eventually both men reached the uncomfortable realization that they were getting older. Stephen's son, Eustace, had been expected to inherit, but Eustace died in 1553. That changed everything. There was now no obvious future heir for Stephen. Henry, on the other hand, was young and increasingly powerful, so Stephen and Henry negotiated. The result was the Treaty of Wallingford. Stephen remained king for the rest of his life. Henry became his recognized heir, and Matilda did not become Queen of England. This is an important part of her story. She fought for years. She came remarkably close. She defeated Stephen's forces. She entered London. She controlled large parts of the kingdom. And yet, she never actually received the crown. Instead, she achieved something else. She made sure her son inherited. Henry became King Henry II in 1554, and with him came the beginning of the Angevin dynasty. So Matilda lost the throne she believed was hers, but she did not lose everything. She became the mother of a king. She continued to exercise influence. She lived in Normandy during much of her later life, and she remained an important political figure. In fact, Henry II relied on her. She helped govern territories on the continent. She managed estates. She handled political affairs, and she continued to command respect. The woman who once tried to take England by force eventually became something slightly different, a kingmaker, and perhaps that was the closest medieval politics would allow her to come to victory. Matilda died in 1667. She was about 65. She was buried at Rouen Cathedral. Her tomb inscription remembered her as a great woman and ruler. The crown itself had never rested on her head, but her son had worn it, and that mattered. So in the end, Matilda's story is really not about losing a throne. It's about how difficult.
Eleanor of Aquitaine had already been queen twice, which was impressive. It was also exhausting. She had been Queen of France, then she had become Queen of England. She had inherited one of the wealthiest territories in medieval Europe. She had married 2 kings. She had raised several children who would become kings, queens, dukes, and political headaches. And at one point, she decided that perhaps rebelling against her husband was a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Her husband disagreed. Naturally. Eleanor was born around 1222. She was the daughter of William X, Duke of Aquitaine. Aquitaine was enormous. It covered much of what is now southwestern France. It was wealthy. It was culturally sophisticated, and importantly, it belonged to Eleanor. When her father died in 1337, Eleanor inherited the duchy. She was still very young, and suddenly she controlled one of the largest and richest territories in Western Europe. This made her an extremely valuable bride. King Louis VI of France understood this, so Eleanor was married to his son, Louis. The wedding took place in 1337, and within days, Louis became king. Eleanor therefore became Queen of France. Her life changed immediately. She had moved from being a young duchess to being the queen of one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe.
But the marriage was not particularly successful. Louis was deeply religious. Eleanor was more worldly. She had grown up in the sophisticated court of Aquitaine. She was accustomed to music, poetry, courtly culture, and political independence. Louis was more restrained. The two were simply very different. And they also had a problem. They had 2 daughters, but no surviving son. In medieval politics, this could become a serious issue. A king without a son had a succession problem. A queen without a son could become the subject of suspicion. Eventually, the marriage was annulled in 1552. Eleanor regained control of Aquitaine, and almost immediately she remarried. Her new husband was Henry, Duke of Normandy. He was much younger than Eleanor. He was also extremely ambitious. 2 years later, Henry became King of England. Eleanor became Queen of England. Again. This was a remarkable transition. She had gone from Queen of France to Duchess of Aquitaine, and then to Queen of England. And her new husband was not a quiet man. Henry II was energetic. He was intelligent. He was ambitious. He traveled constantly. He wanted to control his territories personally, and he was not especially interested in sharing authority. At first, Henry and Eleanor worked well together. They had a large family. Their children included Henry the young king, Richard, Geoffrey, John, and several daughters. This was an impressive collection. It was also the beginning of an enormous family problem, because Henry had inherited a vast collection of territories, and he wanted his sons to inherit them. The trouble was that Henry did not always want to give them real authority. He gave his sons titles, he arranged marriages, he held coronations, but he continued to control the actual government. Henry the young king was crowned during his father's lifetime. Richard was given Aquitaine, Geoffrey received Brittany through marriage, John was given lands. The family had plenty of titles. What they did not have was enough independence, and the young princes were not pleased. Neither was Eleanor. By the 1170s, tensions inside the family were becoming severe. Henry the young king wanted power. Richard wanted to control Aquitaine. Geoffrey had ambitions of his own. John was still young, and Eleanor increasingly sided with her sons. Then, in 1173, the family rebellion began. Henry's sons rebelled against their father. Eleanor supported them. This was a major political decision. She was not merely complaining about her husband's parenting style. She was participating in a rebellion against the king, and Henry was not amused. The rebellion spread across his territories. Fighting took place in England and Normandy. Eleanor attempted to travel from Aquitaine towards her son's territories. She was captured, and this was the moment when one of the most powerful women in Europe became a prisoner. Henry did not execute her. He did not publicly humiliate her. Instead, he kept her under guard for years, decades, in fact. Eleanor remained imprisoned for much of the rest of Henry's reign. She was not locked in a tiny dungeon. Again, medieval royal imprisonment could be strangely comfortable. She had servants, she had rooms, she had food. She could sometimes receive visitors, but she could not simply leave. She could not return to Aquitaine whenever she wanted. She could not build an independent political network, and she could not openly challenge Henry. The Queen had become a prisoner. This was particularly striking because Eleanor had once been one of the most politically active women in Europe. She had ruled Aquitaine. She had participated in the Second Crusade. She had traveled across Europe. She had negotiated marriages. She had governed territories. And now she was being watched. For years.
Henry moved her between different residences. She spent time at places such as Winchester and Sarum. The details of her daily life are not always clear. This is one of the frustrating things about medieval history. We know the major events. We know that Eleanor was confined. We know she had servants. We know she remained politically important. But we do not have a diary describing every breakfast. Sadly, a medieval queen's breakfast diary would answer so many questions. Was the bread good? Was Henry's custodian annoying? Did Eleanor complain about the weather? Did she secretly enjoy being left alone? We simply do not know. What we do know is that her imprisonment did not destroy her position completely. She remained a queen. She remained the mother of princes, and she remained the Duchess of Aquitaine. Her lands were still connected to her identity. Her family could not simply erase her. And then Henry's political situation began to change. His sons continued to rebel. Henry the young king died in 1883. Geoffrey died in 1886. Richard became increasingly powerful. John remained. And eventually, Henry II's reign came to an end. In 1189, Henry died. Richard became king, and Eleanor was released. She was now an older woman, but she was not finished. Far from it. One of the strangest things about Eleanor's story is how quickly she returned to political activity after years of confinement. She did not spend the rest of her life quietly sitting in a castle. She began traveling. She administered territories. She negotiated. She acted on behalf of Richard. And when Richard left for the Third Crusade, Eleanor helped manage the kingdom. Again, this was remarkable. Imagine spending years under guard and then almost immediately being asked to help run the government. Apparently, Richard trusted his mother considerably more than Henry had. Or perhaps he simply understood that she was extremely good at the job. Either way, Eleanor returned to public life, and she was now in her late 60s, which makes some modern retirement plans look rather timid. Richard eventually became a prisoner in Europe after the Crusade. He was captured while traveling home. His enemies demanded an enormous ransom, and Eleanor helped organize the money needed to free him. She traveled, she negotiated, she collected funds, she wrote letters, she managed the political crisis. Again, she was doing the work of a much younger person. And then Richard died in 1199. His brother John became king, and Eleanor supported John. She helped secure his succession. This was not necessarily because John was a wonderful person. He was not exactly famous for making everyone comfortable, but Eleanor understood dynastic politics. She knew that keeping the family together was more important than personal affection, so she continued working, even in old age. She traveled to Castile to arrange a marriage involving her granddaughter Blanche. The journey was long, the political stakes were high, and Eleanor was now well into her 70s. Yet she went. She returned to France. She crossed.
Our next queen already had a crown. She had a husband who was king. She had children. She had wealth. She had a magnificent court, and technically she had everything a medieval queen was supposed to want. Unfortunately, her husband was Edward II of England, and Edward had a remarkable talent for making his political enemies feel neglected. This was not ideal. Eleanor of France was born around 1295. She was the daughter of Philip IV of France, a king famous for his handsome appearance, his ruthless politics, and his general ability to make nearly everyone around him nervous. So Isabella was born into one of the most powerful royal families in Europe. She was raised with the expectation that marriage would be political,
and eventually she was married to Edward II. The marriage was arranged to improve relations between England and France, which was sensible. England and France had been arguing over territory and influence for generations. A royal marriage seemed like a nice way to calm things down. Naturally, it did not. Isabella arrived in England as a young teenager. She was crowned queen in 2008, and very quickly she found herself in a difficult position. Edward had favourites. The first was Piers Gaveston. Gaveston was not a royal. He was not a great prince. He was simply a close companion of Edward. But Edward trusted him deeply, and he gave him enormous influence. Edward's nobles hated this. They believed Gaveston had too much power. They believed he was enriching himself. They believed Edward was ignoring the traditional aristocracy, and Isabella, as queen, was caught in the middle. At first she seems to have tolerated the arrangement, but Gaveston was eventually executed by a group of rebellious nobles. Edward was furious, and another favourite eventually appeared, Hugh Despenser the Younger. Despenser became even more powerful. He controlled access to the king, he accumulated land, he influenced royal decisions, and Isabella increasingly found herself excluded. This was not simply a marital disagreement, it was a political problem. The Queen was the daughter of the King of France. She had her own family connections, she had supporters, she had money, she had children, and she had every reason to believe that she should have a meaningful role at court. Instead, she found herself watching another man become the center of her husband's political world. This was deeply humiliating, and Isabella did not respond by quietly knitting. She began building alliances. Her position became more serious after the English invaded France in 1224. The conflict became known as the War of Saint Sardos. Isabella's brother, Charles IV of France, demanded that Edward come to France to negotiate. Edward did not go. Instead, Isabella went, and this was politically significant. She traveled to France and helped negotiate a settlement. For a brief period, she was acting almost independently of her husband. She was not merely the queen sitting beside the king. She was a political actor. And while in France, Isabella began developing a relationship with Roger Mortimer. Mortimer was an English nobleman who had opposed the Despensers. He had been imprisoned, he escaped, and eventually he ended up in France. Isabella and Mortimer became allies. Whether their relationship began as political cooperation or something more intimate is difficult to separate from the later propaganda surrounding them. But by the late 1220s, they were clearly working together, and Edward's government was becoming increasingly unstable. The Despensers had many enemies. Isabella returned to England in 1226, but she did not return alone. She came with an army. This was no longer a diplomatic mission, it was an invasion. Isabella declared that she was acting against the Despensers. Her stated target was not necessarily the king himself. She was presenting herself as a queen rescuing the kingdom from corrupt advisers. This was politically clever. If she had simply announced that she intended to overthrow her husband, support might have been harder to obtain. Instead, she could claim that she was restoring proper government, and people joined her. Edward's support collapsed remarkably quickly. Several nobles defected, royal officials abandoned him, the king fled, the Despensers were captured, and Isabella's forces took control of England. Hugh Despenser the Younger was executed. His death was brutal, and contemporary accounts described a public punishment designed to make an example of him. Isabella, meanwhile, had achieved something extraordinary. She had overthrown her husband. Edward II was still king in theory, but in practice he no longer controlled the kingdom. He was captured. He was forced to abdicate in favor of his son, Edward III. He was only 14, and Isabella became one of the most powerful people in England. She was sometimes called the She-Wolf of France. The nickname became famous later, but it is worth remembering that medieval political propaganda was rarely subtle. A powerful woman who overthrew a king was not going to receive a flattering description from everyone. She was dangerous, she was foreign, she was ambitious, she had an army, she had a male political partner, and she had removed a reigning king. Naturally, people found this unsettling. For a few years, Isabella and Mortimer effectively governed England. Edward III was king, but his mother and her ally held the real power. They managed royal finances, they appointed officials, they influenced policy, they rewarded supporters, and they became increasingly wealthy. At first, this arrangement worked, then it began to fall apart, because Isabella and Mortimer had made one very important mistake. They had forgotten that Edward III was growing up. A teenage king can be controlled. An adult king is considerably less convenient. Edward was surrounded by people who resented Mortimer's influence. He also had his own ideas, and Mortimer's growing wealth was an obvious target. By 1230, Edward decided that he had had enough. He moved against Mortimer. The operation was carried out at Nottingham Castle. A secret passage allowed Edward and his supporters to enter the castle at night. Mortimer was captured, Isabella was placed under guard, and the political arrangement that had governed England for several years ended almost overnight. Mortimer was executed, Isabella was not. And this is where her story becomes another example of the strange rules surrounding defeated queens. Edward couldn't simply treat her mother like an ordinary political criminal. She was her mother, she was the Queen Dowager, she was the daughter of the King of France, and she remained a member of the royal family. So, instead of executing her, Edward sent her to a form of comfortable confinement. Isabella was taken to Castle Rising in Norfolk, and there she remained for much of the rest of her life. The castle was not a dungeon, it was a royal residence. There were servants, there was food, there were rooms, there were gardens, there were chapels. There was enough comfort that Isabella's imprisonment could almost look like retirement. Almost. But she was no longer free to interfere in politics. That was the important part. Edward III had solved the problem. His mother could live. She could be treated with respect, but she could not return to politics. This arrangement lasted for years, and Isabella seems to have adjusted to it. She remained wealthy. She continued to receive an income. She maintained her household. She had religious interests. She owned books and personal possessions. She was not forgotten. She simply disappeared from the center of political life. This is one of the recurring patterns in the history of defeated queens. A powerful woman could be too important to kill, but too dangerous to release. So the solution was often a comfortable prison, a beautiful cage, stone walls instead of iron bars, servants instead of jailers, fine clothing instead of prison uniforms, and a carefully controlled correspondence instead of complete freedom. Isabella lived like this for the rest of her life. She died in 1558. She was around 63 years old. She had survived her husband. She had survived Mortimer. She had survived the political collapse of her own regime. And she had lived long enough to see her son become one of the most powerful kings in Europe. In the end, Isabella was buried at the Franciscan church in Newgate. Her story is complicated. For centuries, historians portrayed her as a scheming adulteress, a ruthless woman, a manipulator, the she-wolf. But the modern historians have been more cautious. Some of the most dramatic accusations against
Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn's story begins with something rather unusual. She became queen because a king wanted to marry her, and she lost her crown because that same king wanted to marry someone else, which, when you put it that way, makes the entire arrangement sound considerably less romantic. Anne was born around the beginning of the 15th century. Her family belonged to the English aristocracy. They were wealthy, they were connected, and they were ambitious. Anne spent part of her youth abroad, including time at the French court. There she became familiar with European court culture. She learned languages, she developed refined manners. She dressed fashionably, she understood ceremony, and she returned to England as an unusually sophisticated young woman. At the English court, Anne attracted attention. She was not necessarily considered the most conventionally beautiful woman there, but she was intelligent, she was witty, she could dance, she could converse, she knew how to make herself interesting, and one person became extremely interested: Henry VIII. Henry was already married. His wife was Catherine of Aragon. They had been married for many years. They had a daughter, Mary. But Henry desperately wanted a son. Catherine had suffered several pregnancies that did not produce a surviving male heir, and Henry became convinced that the marriage had somehow failed. Then Anne appeared. Henry wanted her. Anne refused to become simply his mistress. She wanted marriage. She wanted to be queen. And Henry, being Henry, decided that this could be arranged. The problem was Catherine. Henry needed the marriage annulled. The Pope refused. Henry became increasingly frustrated. The political consequences became enormous. England eventually broke with papal authority. The king became head of the Church of England, and all of this was, at least in part, connected to Henry's desire to marry Anne. This was rather a lot of political restructuring for one courtship. Anne became queen in 1533. She was pregnant. Henry was convinced that the child would be a son. Instead, the child was a daughter, Elizabeth. This was not the result Henry had hoped for, but Elizabeth would later become Elizabeth I, so history had quietly prepared a consolation prize. Anne's position remained precarious. She had enemies. Many people remained loyal to Catherine. Others disliked Anne because they believed she had caused the king to abandon his first wife, and Henry himself was becoming increasingly impatient. Anne became pregnant again. The pregnancy ended in miscarriage. Another pregnancy followed. Again, there was no surviving son. Henry's confidence in Anne began to collapse. And when a king loses interest in a queen, the queen's position can be extremely dangerous. Anne's enemies understood this. Thomas Cromwell, one of Henry's most powerful ministers, eventually turned against her. Accusations began to circulate. Anne was accused of adultery. She was accused of having relationships with several men. She was accused of incest with her brother George. The accusations were extraordinary. They were also politically useful. There is no good evidence that Anne committed the crimes for which she was condemned. The evidence against her was deeply questionable. Some of the accused men were almost certainly innocent, but the legal process moved quickly. Anne was arrested, and this is where our story turns. One day she was queen, the next she was a prisoner in the Tower of London. The Tower had been used as a royal residence, fortress, and prison. For Anne, it became all three things at once. She entered through the complex that had once represented royal power. Now she was being held there under guard. Her household was reduced, her movements were restricted, her future was uncertain, and she knew what had happened to Catherine.
She understood that royal marriage could end very badly. Anne was not treated like an ordinary prisoner. She had attendants, she was given food, she retained some dignity. But the emotional contrast must have been extraordinary. Only a short time earlier, she had occupied the highest position in England. Now guards stood between her and the outside world. Anne's trial took place at Westminster. She was convicted. Her marriage to Henry was declared invalid, and her daughter, Elizabeth, was declared illegitimate. The machinery of the state moved with astonishing speed. Anne was condemned to death. She returned to the Tower, and then she waited. The waiting is perhaps one of the strangest parts of her story. She had no army, no way to escape, no realistic political path back to the throne. Her husband had already decided what would happen. She was simply waiting for the execution. On the morning of May 19, 1936, Anne was taken to the scaffold. She spoke briefly, she prayed, and she was executed by a French swordsman. She was 30-something years old. Her reign had lasted less than 3 years, and her daughter was left without her mother. Elizabeth was only a small child. She would not see Anne again. And yet, decades later, Elizabeth would become queen. This makes Anne's story especially strange. Anne lost almost everything: her crown, her husband, her reputation, her life. Her daughter was declared illegitimate, but Elizabeth survived, and Elizabeth would eventually restore some of the prestige surrounding her mother's memory. Anne was buried without the sort of grand royal funeral that might have been expected for a queen. Her remains were placed in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula at the Tower. For years, her resting place remained uncertain. Eventually, during 19th century restoration work, the graves were identified. Anne was reburied in the chapel. Her story became larger than her life. She became one of the most famous queens in English history. And this is where we should slow down, because Anne Boleyn is often presented as a romantic tragedy. The beautiful young woman who captured the heart of the king, the seductive queen who changed England, the doomed wife who was betrayed. But the historical reality is more complicated. Anne was ambitious, she understood politics, she wanted power, she wanted to secure her position, she wanted her daughter protected. She was also living in an environment where political loyalty could change overnight. The same king who had broken with Rome for her could abandon her. The same courts that had celebrated her coronation could watch her arrest. The same title that made her powerful could make her more dangerous when she lost it. And the Tower itself became a symbol of this transformation. For centuries, people had entered the Tower as prisoners. Anne entered it as queen. Then she left it for the scaffold. The walls did not change. Her position did. This is one of the central patterns in the stories of overthrown queens. The physical world can remain almost exactly the same. The palace is still there, the servants are still there, the guards are still there, the rooms are still there, but the doors are locked. And that is enough. Anne's downfall was remarkably fast. She had spent years becoming queen. The process of getting Henry's marriage to Catherine annulled had transformed England. The political consequences were enormous. But once Henry decided Anne became a problem, the state moved against her with frightening efficiency. Her supporters were arrested, her enemies were empowered, her marriage was invalidated, her daughter was declared illegitimate, and within weeks, she was dead. The lesson was brutal. Royal power depended on the king, and Anne had married a king whose affection could be dangerously temporary. Henry would marry again almost immediately. His next wife was Jane Seymour. Jane gave him the son he wanted. Edward was born in 1937, and Henry was delighted. The political story moved on. Anne did not. she remained a memory. But her daughter Elizabeth survived, and Elizabeth's survival changed everything. Elizabeth eventually became queen in 1558. She ruled for 42 years. During her reign, Anne's mother's story was treated carefully. Elizabeth did not openly make her mother's memory the center of her politics. That would have been dangerous. But Elizabeth knew who her mother was. She knew what had happened, and she understood that her own legitimacy was connected to a complicated family history. Elizabeth had been declared illegitimate, then restored to the succession, then left behind the throne, then returned to it. Her life was almost a political argument about whether legitimacy could be repaired, and she won by becoming queen. Anne could not know that. When she died, Elizabeth was only a child. Anne could not.
Marie Antoinette had almost everything a queen could possibly have: a palace, jewels, servants, silk dresses, a famous husband, and eventually a very unhappy country, which is not the ideal combination. She was born in Vienna in 1755, the youngest daughter of Maria Theresa, the powerful empress of the Habsburg monarchy. Her childhood was royal from the beginning. She grew up surrounded by tutors, music, religion, etiquette, and an almost endless stream of political conversations. Her future had already been planned. She would marry into another European dynasty. The marriage would strengthen an alliance, and everyone would be satisfied, or at least everyone important. At 14, Marie Antoinette was married to Louis Auguste, the future Louis XVI of France. She crossed the border between Austria and France and was ceremonially transformed into a French princess. Her clothes were changed, her Austrian possessions were removed, even her personal attendants were replaced. It was a symbolic way of saying that the young girl who entered France was no longer entirely Austrian. She belonged to France now. The marriage itself was not immediately successful. Louis was shy. Marie Antoinette was young. Both were inexperienced, and the royal court watched them constantly. Every meal, every appearance, every private decision. The Queen's life was public in ways that would seem almost unbearable today. Even getting dressed could become a ceremony. People could gather to watch. Rank determined who was allowed to help with clothing. There were rules about everything, and Marie Antoinette was expected to perform the role perfectly. She was not yet queen, but everyone was already watching. Then, in 1774, Louis XV died. Marie Antoinette's husband became King Louis XVI. She became queen. She was 19, and France was already experiencing serious financial problems. The royal court was expensive. The government was deeply in debt. The tax system was inefficient. France had spent enormous amounts supporting the American colonies during their war against Britain. And beneath the magnificent ceremonies of Versailles, ordinary people in Paris were dealing with rising economic pressure. Marie Antoinette did not personally create these problems. She became a convenient symbol of them. She was foreign, she was young, she lived at Versailles, and she wore expensive clothes. That was enough. Rumors began to spread. Some were political attacks, some were simply gossip, and some were completely invented. She was called extravagant. She was accused of interfering in government. She was accused of having numerous lovers. She was accused of betraying France for Austria. And eventually, she acquired the famous nickname Madame Deficit. It was a catchy insult. History tends to remember catchy insults. The reality was more complicated. Marie Antoinette did spend money. She enjoyed fashion. She had an elaborate wardrobe. She spent heavily on her private apartments and entertainments. But the French monarchy's financial crisis was vastly larger than the spending of one young queen. Still, symbols are powerful, and Marie Antoinette had become the symbol. Then came the problem of children. For years, Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI did not produce an heir. This became a public obsession.
People speculated about their marriage. There were rumors about Louis's health. There were rumors about Marie Antoinette's private life. Eventually, children were born. A daughter came first, then a son. For a moment, the royal family seemed secure. Marie Antoinette became deeply attached to her children. She increasingly withdrew from the enormous formalities of Versailles. She enjoyed gardens, music, theater, informal gatherings, and she became fascinated with a pastoral style of life. There were rustic buildings, artificial farm settings, simple-looking clothing. It was an attempt to create a private world away from the exhausting rituals of Versailles. To her, it was probably relaxing. To critics, it looked absurd. A queen pretending to be a peasant, while France's real peasants were struggling to survive. Again, the image was more powerful than the reality. Then came 1789. France's financial crisis had become a political crisis. The Estates General was summoned. The Third Estate demanded greater political representation. The old system began to collapse. And then, ordinary people in Paris became increasingly angry. The Bastille was stormed. Revolution spread. The royal family was no longer secure. Marie Antoinette's world began to shrink. The palace that had once been her playground became a dangerous place. Then, in October 1789, crowds marched from Paris to Versailles. They demanded bread, they demanded political change, and they demanded that the royal family move to Paris. The king and queen were forced to leave Versailles. They were taken to the Tuileries Palace in Paris. This was effectively the beginning of their captivity. Marie Antoinette was still queen, but the meaning of the title had changed. She could not freely leave. Her movements were watched. Her correspondence was monitored. The revolutionary government became increasingly suspicious of her. Marie Antoinette also began secretly working to preserve the monarchy. She communicated with foreign powers. She hoped that European rulers might intervene. This was politically dangerous. France's revolutionaries saw foreign monarchies as threats, and Marie Antoinette was the daughter of the Austrian empress. Her connections made her especially suspicious. In 1791, the royal family attempted to escape Paris. They reached the town of Varennes. Then they were recognized. The escape failed. They were brought back to Paris. This was a major turning point. The royal family had tried to flee. For many revolutionaries, this confirmed their belief that the king and queen could not be trusted. The monarchy's position deteriorated rapidly. In 1792, France went to war with Austria. Marie Antoinette's brother was now the Austrian emperor. This made her position even more dangerous. Revolutionaries believed she might be communicating with Austria. They called her the Austrian. Her enemies increasingly described her as an enemy of France. Then, in August 1792, the Tuileries Palace was attacked. The Swiss guards defending the palace were overwhelmed. The royal family fled to the Legislative Assembly. They were suspended from power. The monarchy was effectively finished. Marie Antoinette was no longer queen in any meaningful sense. She was now a prisoner. The family was moved to the Temple prison. There, the conditions became increasingly restrictive. The queen's world became tiny. A few rooms, a few servants, her children, her husband, and guards outside the door. Then, Louis XVI was put on trial. He was found guilty. In January 1793, he was executed by guillotine. Marie Antoinette was now a widow, and her position became even more precarious. She was no longer useful as the wife of a living king. She was simply a former queen, a foreign-born prisoner, and the revolutionaries had little reason to treat her gently. Her son, Louis Charles, was taken from her. This was devastating. The child was only 8 years old. He was separated from his mother and placed under revolutionary supervision. Marie Antoinette eventually was transferred to the conciergerie. Unlike the royal apartments at Versailles, this was a real prison. The queen's privileges had largely disappeared. She lived under guard. She had little privacy. She was sick. She was exhausted, and she knew that her future was probably very short. Her trial began in October 1793. She was accused of treason. She was accused of wasting national money. She was accused of communicating with foreign powers, and she faced an especially ugly accusation involving her own son. The allegation was shocking. It was also almost certainly intended to destroy whatever sympathy she might still have had. Marie Antoinette responded with dignity. She denied the accusations, she defended herself, and when the accusation involving her son was raised, she appealed to the mothers in the courtroom. That moment reportedly affected the audience, but the verdict had already been decided politically. She was found guilty. She was sentenced to death. On the morning of 16 October 1793, Marie Antoinette was taken from the prison. She was placed in an open cart. Her hair had been cut short. She wore a simple white dress. The woman who had once traveled through Versailles surrounded by luxury was now being transported through Paris under guard. Crowds watched, some shouted, others simply stared. The journey ended at the place of revolution. There, the former queen was executed. She was 37 years old. Her reign ended in a very different place from where it began. No chandeliers, no silk, no royal ceremony, no royal music, just the machinery of a revolution. But Marie Antoinette's story did not end there. The revolution continued, the monarchy disappeared, the political order of France changed, and eventually the memory of the queen became something much larger than the woman herself. She became a symbol. To some, she represented aristocratic arrogance. To others, she became a tragic figure destroyed.
Isabella II of Spain. Isabella II of Spain became queen when she was only 3 years old, which is a rather unreasonable age to be responsible for an entire country. At 3, most people are still negotiating with their parents about bedtime. Isabella was already at the center of a national political crisis. Her father, Ferdinand VII, had no surviving son, so before his death he changed the succession rules. His daughter Isabella would inherit the throne. This decision created an enormous problem, because Ferdinand's brother, Don Carlos, believed the crown should belong to him, and he had supporters, quite a lot of them. They believed a woman should not inherit the Spanish throne. They supported traditional succession rules, and when Ferdinand died in 1833, Spain effectively split into 2 political camps. One side supported the little girl, the other supported her uncle. Isabella was queen, but she was 3 years old, so obviously she was not running the government herself. Her mother, Maria Christina, became regent, and Spain entered a period of civil war. The conflict became known as the First Carlist War. The Carlists supported Don Carlos, the opposing side supported Isabella and the constitutional monarchy. So Isabella's reign began with soldiers fighting over whether she should be queen at all, a slightly unfortunate introduction to monarchy. Her mother tried to protect her position, but politics was complicated. Maria Cristina eventually remarried secretly to Agustin Fernando Muñoz. The marriage caused controversy. She had to balance the interests of liberals, conservatives, military leaders, and royal relatives. Meanwhile, Isabella remained a child surrounded by adults who were constantly arguing about her future. And this became a recurring feature of her life. She was queen, but other people kept deciding what the queen should do. In 1840, Maria Cristina was forced to leave Spain. The general Baldomero Espartaro became regent. He was powerful, he was popular with some liberals, and he had his own political agenda. Isabella remained the legal monarchy, but again someone else was governing in her name. Eventually, the political class decided that this arrangement was becoming inconvenient. So in 1843, Isabella was declared legally old enough to rule. She was 13. Apparently, Spain had decided that 13 was an acceptable age to become personally responsible for national politics. It was certainly more manageable than 3, but not by much. Isabella became queen in her own right, and almost immediately she became the focus of competing political factions: moderates, progressives, military officers, court advisors, relatives. Everyone wanted influence over the young queen, and Isabella grew up inside this environment. She was not given a calm education in government.
She was surrounded by intrigue. She was taught ceremony. She was instructed in religion. She was introduced to political advisors. But her personal life was also being treated as a matter of state, especially her marriage. Spain needed an heir, so Isabella needed a husband. The problem was finding one. Several European royal families were considered. Various candidates were discussed. And eventually Isabella was married to her cousin, Francisco de Assis de Bourbon. The marriage took place in 1846. Isabella was 16, Francisco was her cousin, and their relationship was not considered particularly happy. Contemporary accounts portray Francisco uncomfortable with Isabella's temperament and political environment. The marriage became a subject of endless gossip. The royal court was already full of rumours. Now there were rumours about the Queen's private life, and those rumours became political weapons. Isabella had several children. Some died very young. One surviving son was Alfonso. He would eventually become Alfonso XII, and his existence would become very important. Because Isabella's reign was never stable, she had political supporters. She also had political enemies. She was deeply involved in government decisions, but she was not always consistent. Different ministers rose and fell. Military officers became powerful. Political factions fought for influence. And Isabella sometimes reacted impulsively. She could be generous. She could be stubborn. She could be deeply religious. She could also become involved in court intrigues. Her personal preferences mattered because the monarchy was still closely tied to government. And when the Queen made a political decision, the consequences could be enormous. This was one of the central problems of her reign. The monarchy was supposed to provide stability. Instead, Isabella's court became associated with instability. Ministers changed frequently, governments collapsed, political factions fought for influence, and the Queen herself became increasingly unpopular. There was also the problem of public perception. Isabella was often portrayed as irresponsible. Some of the accusations were unfair, some were exaggerated, but enough political scandals accumulated that the monarchy became increasingly difficult to defend. Her private life was constantly discussed. Her relationships were scrutinized. Her religious practices were criticized. Her spending was criticized. Her political decisions were criticized. Even her appearance became part of political commentary. It is difficult to imagine living like that. Every mistake becomes public. Every argument becomes political. Every friend becomes a possible scandal. And every family problem becomes a matter of national interest. Eventually, opposition to Isabella became much stronger. In 1868, a military uprising began. It was known as the Glorious Revolution. The movement quickly gained support. Isabella's government collapsed. The Queen was forced to leave Spain. She crossed the border into France. And just like that, after 35 years as Queen, Isabella was no longer a in Spain. She was in exile. The irony was considerable. She had been Queen since the age of 3. She had never really known ordinary life. She had been raised inside palaces. She had been surrounded by officials. She had spent her entire existence at the center of Spanish politics. And now she had been removed from the country entirely. She settled in France. She lived in Paris. Her life there was considerably more comfortable than the lives of many ordinary exiles. She had money. She retained her title. She maintained a household. She continued to receive visitors. She remained connected to European royalty. But she was no longer Queen. And perhaps even more strangely, her son was becoming increasingly important. Alfonso was still young. He had been taken into exile with the royal family. But political supporters began to see him as a possible solution. Perhaps Spain did not want Isabella back, but perhaps it wanted her son. This was not exactly flattering. It was also politically practical. Alfonso was young. He had the Bourbon name. He was male. And importantly, he did not carry all the political baggage associated with his mother's reign. The Restoration movement gradually gained strength. Isabella herself eventually abdicated in favor of Alfonso. In 1870, she formally gave up her rights to the throne in his favor. Her son became the focus of the Bourbon Restoration, and in 1874, Alfonso became King Alfonso XII. Isabella had lost her kingdom. Her son had regained it. This was an unusual kind of royal defeat. She was not executed. She was not imprisoned. She was not forced into a convent. She simply became unnecessary. Her son could be king, and she could remain in France, watching, waiting, and occasionally interfering. Because naturally, Isabella did not suddenly stop having opinions. She remained connected to royal politics. She continued to receive Spanish visitors. She maintained her own court. She was still a Bourbon. She was still the mother of the king, and she still had influence among some royalists. But Alfonso wanted to rule in his own way. His mother had become associated with the old political system. He needed to create a different image, more stable, more constitutional, more respectable. So Isabella's political role was reduced. This must have been strange for her. For more than 30 years she had been the center of Spain. Now her son occupied that position. She was still his mother, still a queen in the courtesy sense, but no longer the ruler. And there was another uncomfortable detail. Alfonso was trying to build legitimacy partly by distancing himself from the politics that had destroyed Isabella's reign. He was not rejecting his mother personally, but politically he needed to be different from her. So Isabella watched a new monarchy being built around her son. And perhaps there was some relief in it, because Alfonso's reign was more stable than hers had been. He became a constitutional monarch. He supported a political system designed to prevent the constant instability of earlier decades. The Bourbon monarchy was restored, and Isabella remained alive to see it happen. She lived in Paris for many years. She traveled. She attended family events. She visited Spain occasionally. She remained connected to European royal society, but she never regained the throne. Her son had it, and that was that. There is something quietly sad about this kind of exile. Not because Isabella lived in poverty, she did not. She lived comfortably. She had servants. She had social connections. She had a substantial household. But comfort is not the same thing as belonging. Spain was her kingdom. She had been its queen since childhood, and now she could only visit. Imagine that. A country where every palace had once belonged to your world. A capital where your portrait still hung. A national history in which your name appeared again and again. And yet you were living elsewhere. A former queen watching another generation move on. Isabella lived until 1904. She was 69. She died in Paris. By then, the world had changed dramatically. She had been born in the age of horse-drawn carriages and absolute monarchy. She lived through industrialization, railways, telegraphs, new political movements, the rise of modern nationalism, and the transformation of Europe. Her son Alfonso XII had died young in 1885, so Isabella did not even outlive her own son. But his descendants continued the Bourbon line. Her grandson, Alfonso XIII, eventually became king, so Isabella's family remained on the Spanish throne. Her own reign had failed, but the dynasty survived, and that is perhaps the strange balance in her story. She lost Spain, but she did not lose the dynasty. She was overthrown, but her son returned. She became an exile, but her family returned to the palace. She was no longer queen, but she remained the mother of a king, and sometimes that was enough to keep her politically relevant. Isabella's life also shows how difficult it can be for a woman to rule during a period of political transformation. Spain was struggling with competing visions of government. Some wanted traditional monarchy, others wanted constitutional government. Some wanted broader political participation, others wanted staunted royal authority, and Isabella was placed directly in the middle of all of it. She did not create these divisions, but she became associated with them. Her mistakes became symbols, her court became a target, her personal life became political ammunition, and eventually the monarchy itself became too unpopular to survive. The Revolution of 1868 did not simply remove a queen, it removed an entire political system, and Isabella was the most visible face of that system. That is why her exile was probably inevitable once the revolution succeeded. She could not simply return to Madrid and continue as though nothing had happened. Too many people wanted a new beginning, and Alfonso provided one, a younger king, a cleaner political image, a chance to restore the monarchy without restoring all of Isabella's political baggage. So Isabella stayed in France. The woman who had once been Spain's center became a peripheral figure. She was still invited to royal events, still photographed, still recognized, but no longer obeyed. There is a particular kind of melancholy in that, not the melancholy of a dungeon, not the horror of an execution, something quieter. You wake up one morning and realize the world has moved on without you. The palace still exists, the crown still exists, the dynasty still exists, but someone else is wearing the crown. And perhaps the most unusual part is that the person wearing it is your own child. Isabella had spent decades as queen, then she spent decades as the queen mother in exile. She watched Alfonso become king, she watched him establish his own court, she watched Spain slowly stabilize, she watched her grandson eventually inherit the throne. Her family had returned, but she had not, and that distinction remained. Still, Isabella's later life was not entirely unhappy. She had family, she had wealth, she had friends, she remained interested in Spain, she sometimes visited, and she lived long enough to become almost a historical figure while still alive. The young queen of 1833 had become an elderly woman in Paris. The civil wars of her childhood were distant memories. The generals who had controlled her early reign were gone. The politicians who had surrounded her were gone. Her son was gone too, and yet the dynasty remained. History had taken the throne from Isabella, but it had not erased her. Perhaps that is the gentlest way to understand her ending. She was no longer the ruler, but she remained part of the story, and perhaps after so many years of political turmoil, that might have been enough. The old queen could finally watch rather than command. She could listen rather than decide. She could remember rather than govern, and sometimes after a lifetime of royal responsibility, that might almost feel peaceful. Of course, she probably still had opinions. This was Isabella. We should not expect miracles. But the great political battles were over. Spain had moved forward. Her son had ruled. Her grandson had inherited. And the Bourbon dynasty continued. So
Mary, Queen of Scots, was queen before she was old enough to understand what the word meant. She became queen when she was only 6 days old, which is an impressive title to receive before you've even had time to develop an opinion about breakfast. Mary was born in 1542. Her father was James V of Scotland. Her mother was Mary of Guise, a French noblewoman from the powerful House of Guise. Scotland was already politically complicated. It was caught between competing religious movements. England was ruled by Henry VIII. France wanted Scotland as an ally, and the Scottish nobility was never particularly famous for making things simple. Then James V died. Mary became queen. She was an infant, so her mother acted as regent. But Henry VIII of England immediately saw an opportunity. He wanted Mary to marry his son Edward. The idea was simple. If Mary married Edward, Scotland and England might eventually be joined. But Scottish nobles did not all like this plan. Some feared English domination, others preferred an alliance with France, and Scotland soon became divided. Mary was sent to France for safety. She was raised at the French court. This was an extraordinary environment. She grew up around princes. She learned French. She learned music. She learned courtly manners. She became highly educated. She was tall, elegant, and charismatic, and she was already queen. At 16, she married Francis, the heir to France. At 17, Francis became king. Mary was now Queen of France as well as Queen of Scotland.
For a brief moment, her position was extraordinary. She was young, beautiful, rich, and connected to two royal dynasties. But the good fortune did not last. Francis was chronically ill. He died in 1560. Mary was 18. Suddenly she was a widow, and she had lost her position at the French court. She returned to Scotland. This was a difficult transition. She had spent most of her childhood in France. Scotland was very different. The country was experiencing the Protestant Reformation. Mary was Catholic. Many of her subjects were now Protestant. The political balance was fragile, and the Queen herself was young. Still, Mary tried to rule. She could be politically flexible. She sometimes tolerated Protestant worship. She negotiated with powerful nobles. She attempted to maintain peace, but the situation remained unstable. Then came her second marriage. Mary married Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Darnley was handsome. He was also ambitious, and he had a strong royal claim of his own. The marriage looked politically useful, but it quickly became unhappy. Darnley wanted power. Mary was reluctant to give it to him. Their relationship deteriorated. And then, in 1566, Mary gave birth to a son, James. This child would later become James VI of Scotland and James I of England. So once again, a royal family was producing a child who would eventually inherit far more than anyone could have imagined. But Mary and Darnley's marriage continued to deteriorate. Darnley became increasingly isolated. He was jealous of Mary's advisers, he was suspicious of her friendships, and he resented the influence of others at court. Then, in February 1567, Darnley was found dead near Edinburgh. The circumstances were suspicious. An explosion had destroyed the building where he had been staying, but Darnley's body showed signs that he may have been strangled. The murder caused enormous political damage to Mary. People began asking whether she had been involved. There was no simple proof that she had ordered the murder, but suspicions spread. And then Mary made another controversial decision. She married James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. Bothwell was widely suspected of involvement in Darnley's murder. So Mary had just lost her husband under mysterious circumstances, and then married one of the men many people believed responsible. This was politically disastrous. Nobles rebelled. Mary was captured, and she was forced to abdicate. Her infant son became King James VI of Scotland. Mary was now a former queen. She was 24 years old, and her political career seemed finished. But Mary refused to disappear. She escaped from captivity, she gathered supporters, and she attempted to reclaim the throne. Her forces were defeated at the Battle of Langside in 1568. Mary fled south. She crossed into England. She believed her cousin Elizabeth might help her. This was a reasonable hope. Mary was a fellow queen. She was Elizabeth's cousin, and she was in trouble. Unfortunately, Mary had made rather a serious mistake. Elizabeth could not simply allow Mary to enter England and return to Scotland. Mary had a claim to the English throne. Some Catholics considered her the legitimate Queen of England because they rejected Henry VIII's marriage arrangements and Elizabeth's legitimacy. So Mary was not merely a refugee, she was a potential political threat. Elizabeth therefore decided that Mary could not be allowed to leave freely. Mary was placed under guard. At first, the arrangements were relatively comfortable. She lived in castles and manor houses. She had servants. She could receive visitors. She could write letters. She could sew. She could read. She could hunt. She could maintain a household. But she was not free, and that would remain true for nearly 19 years. Mary moved between different residences, Tutbury, Chatsworth, Sheffield, Wingfield, and others. Her captors tried to balance security with dignity. After all, she was still queen, but she was also a prisoner, and everyone knew it. Mary continued to hope for release. She also remained politically active. She communicated with supporters. She received visitors. She corresponded with foreign powers. She was at the centre of several plots. The most famous was the Babington plot of 1586. A group of conspirators planned to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the English throne. Mary's involvement remains a complicated historical question, but her letters were intercepted. The English government used the letters as evidence. Mary was arrested and put on trial. She was accused of conspiring against Elizabeth. She denied involvement in the assassination plan, but the government believed it had enough evidence. Mary was convicted. She was sentenced to death, and now she faced the same terrible transformation that had destroyed so many queens. She was no longer a royal prisoner. She was a condemned queen. Mary was taken to Fotheringhay Castle. On 8th February 1587, she was led into the Great Hall. She wore dark clothing. She had spent nearly 20 years in captivity. She was 44 years old. She removed her outer garments. Underneath, she wore red, the colour associated with martyrdom. She prayed, and she was executed by beheading. Her reign in Scotland had ended almost 20 years earlier. Her political hopes had ended long before, but her story continued, because Mary had a son, James, and James was still alive. This was important, very important. Elizabeth VIII had no surviving children. Mary's son had a strong claim to the English throne, and when Elizabeth died in 1603, James became King of England. The son of the executed Scottish Queen became ruler of both Scotland and England. Mary lost her throne, she lost her freedom, she lost her life, but her dynasty won. This is one of the great ironies of her story. Elizabeth spent nearly 19 years keeping Mary imprisoned. Elizabeth eventually signed Mary's death warrant. Elizabeth died without an heir, and Mary's son inherited her throne. History has a rather dry sense of humour. It does not always give people what they expect. Mary wanted England. She never got it. Her son did. Mary wanted to return to Scotland. She never did. Her son ruled it. Mary wanted freedom. She never regained it, but her descendants gained enormous power. So what happened to Mary after she was overthrown? She became a prisoner, then a political symbol, then a condemned queen, and eventually a royal ancestor. Her story moved beyond her own life, and perhaps that is where we can leave her, not on the scaffold, not in the prison, but with the quiet image of a young Mary arriving in France many decades earlier, a little Scottish queen surrounded by French courtiers, learning languages, learning music, preparing for a future she could possibly not imagine. She could not know that she would become Queen of France. She could not know that she would lose that crown. She could not know that she would return to Scotland. She could not know that her second marriage would collapse. She could not know that she would become a prisoner in England. And she certainly could not know that her son would one day inherit the throne of the woman who imprisoned her. That is the
Christina of Sweden. Christina of Sweden had a crown. She also had very little interest in behaving like the sort of person people expected to wear one, which, naturally, caused some difficulties. Christina was born in 1626. Her father was Gustavus Adolphus, the famous Swedish king who became one of the leading Protestant rulers during the 30 Years' War. Her mother was Maria Eleanor of Brandenburg. They were their only surviving child, and when her father died in battle in 1632, Christina became queen. She was 6 years old. Once again, a European kingdom had managed to place an infant at the center of government.
Apparently, medieval and early modern monarchies had not yet discovered the useful concept of waiting until Tuesday. Christina's childhood was unusual from the beginning. Her father had reportedly wanted her educated as though she were a prince. She studied languages, she studied history, she studied philosophy, she learned about politics, she learned riding and hunting. She was encouraged to think. This was important because Christina was intensely curious. She loved books, she loved intellectual discussion, she wanted to understand religion, philosophy, science, and classical literature. She also had a personality that did not fit neatly into the expectations of a 17th century queen. She disliked excessive court ceremony. She preferred simple clothing. She sometimes rode horses for long periods. She was famously energetic, and she had little patience for the endless rituals of royal life. She eventually became one of the great intellectual figures of 17th century Europe. But before that could happen, she actually had to govern Sweden. For much of her childhood, Sweden was ruled by a regency. The country was still involved in the 30 Years' War. This was a huge European conflict. Armies moved across Germany. Religious divisions shaped politics. Sweden had become a major military power. Christina inherited a kingdom that was already deeply involved in European affairs. Her education was therefore not merely decorative. She needed to understand diplomacy. She needed to understand war. She needed to understand money. And she needed to understand the personalities of the men who were governing in her name. As she grew older, Christina became increasingly determined to rule herself. She officially began taking control of government in her late teens. By the time she reached her 20s, she was one of Europe's most interesting monarchs. She attracted scholars, artists, scientists, philosophers, musicians, and diplomats. Her court became intellectually fashionable. Christina wanted Sweden to become a center of learning. She collected books. She invited scholars from across Europe. She corresponded with intellectuals, and she became particularly fascinated by René Descartes. Yes, that René Descartes, the philosopher who spent time discussing philosophy with a Swedish queen. It sounds like the beginning of a very quiet joke, but it was real. Christina invited Descartes to Stockholm. He arrived in 1649. The queen wanted lessons and discussions. Unfortunately, Swedish winters were not exactly designed for French philosophers in mind. Christina insisted that Descartes meet her early in the morning, around 5 in the morning, in a cold palace. This was not ideal. Descartes was already in his 50s. He had spent much of his life enjoying a relatively comfortable routine. Now he was being asked to get up before sunrise in freezing Sweden to discuss philosophy with a queen. Naturally, his health suffered. He became seriously ill. He died in Stockholm in 1650. The circumstances have produced various theories. The traditional explanation was pneumonia. Later speculations suggested poisoning. There is no reliable evidence proving that Christina had anything to do with his death. Still, the image remains oddly memorable. A French philosopher travels to Sweden to teach a queen. The queen schedules lessons at dawn. The philosopher gets sick. It is almost as if the monarchy had discovered a new method of warfare. Christina continued her intellectual interests, but she had another problem: marriage. Everyone expected her to marry. She was queen. She needed an heir. The Swedish political system wanted continuity. But Christina had no interest in becoming a conventional royal wife. She resisted marriage. She discussed the matter with advisors. She considered potential husbands, but she repeatedly refused. She had no desire to surrender her independence. And there was another issue.
Christina's personal relationships were unusual for her time. She developed intense friendships with women at court. One of the most famous was Ebba Spara. Christina praised Spara's beauty. She spent a lot of time with her. The nature of their relationship has been debated by historians. Modern labels cannot simply be imposed on 17th century people. But it is clear that Christina's emotional life did not fit neatly into the expectations placed on queens. She also developed close relationships with men. Her friendships and correspondence were often passionate and complicated, but marriage remained something she resisted. Eventually, Christina made an extraordinary decision. She would abdicate. In 1654, she gave up the Swedish throne. She was only 27. This was extremely unusual. Monarchs generally fought desperately to keep their crowns. Christina simply decided that she didn't want hers. She had other interests. She wanted intellectual freedom. She wanted to travel. She wanted to live according to her own choices. And she wanted to avoid marriage. So she left Sweden. Her cousin, Charles X Gustav, became king. Christina began a new life. She traveled through Europe. She eventually converted from Lutheranism to Catholicism. This was a remarkable decision. Sweden was a Protestant kingdom. Its former queen had now become Catholic. The political implications were considerable. Christina settled in Rome, and Rome suited her. She became involved with artists, scholars, musicians, and philosophers. She collected art. She supported cultural institutions. She held intellectual gatherings. She became a familiar figure among Europe's cultural elite. But Christina was still Christina. She could be impulsive. She could be difficult. She could spend money freely. She could become fascinated by a new idea and pursue it intensely. She had left one court. Now she created another, but without the burden of actually ruling a country, which was probably exactly what she wanted. There was another strange chapter. Christina became involved in politics in Naples. She had ambitions. She considered political possibilities, and eventually she became associated with a conspiracy involving the murder of Gian Rinaldo Monaldeschi. In 1657, while Christina was staying at Fontainebleau in France, Monaldeschi was accused of betraying Christina. Christina ordered his execution. The event caused scandal. She was not the Queen of Sweden anymore, but she behaved as though she still possessed the authority of a sovereign. Her decision shocked many observers. The former queen had effectively created her own little royal jurisdiction. It was not particularly reassuring. Christina's reputation became increasingly complicated. To admirers, she was brilliant, independent, courageous, a patron of culture. To critics, she was arrogant, irresponsible, extravagant, and unpredictable. She did not seem particularly interested in pleasing anyone. This made her fascinating. It also made her difficult. She continued traveling. She visited France. She lived in Rome. She met important political figures. She maintained correspondence with European rulers, and she continued collecting books and art. She also became interested in science. She supported scholars. She enjoyed intellectual conversation. She was, in many ways, more comfortable in a library than in a throne room. This is perhaps the simplest way to understand Christina. She did not hate power. She simply preferred intellectual freedom to political responsibility. Being queen required ceremony, marriage, children, religious conformity, political compromises. Christina wanted none of these things. She wanted books, conversation, travel, art, and the freedom to decide what she would do each morning. A surprisingly modern desire, though admittedly, her version involved palaces. Christina never married. She never had children. She remained Catholic, and she remained outside Sweden. She did occasionally consider returning, but
Mary, Queen of Scots, was queen before she was old enough to understand what the word meant. She became queen when she was only 6 days old, which is an impressive title to receive before you've even had time to develop an opinion about breakfast. Mary was born in 1542. Her father was James V of Scotland. Her mother was Mary of Guise, a French noblewoman from the powerful House of Guise. Scotland was already politically complicated. It was caught between competing religious movements. England was ruled by Henry VIII. France wanted Scotland as an ally, and the Scottish nobility was never particularly famous for making things simple. Then James V died. Mary became queen. She was an infant, so her mother acted as regent, but Henry VIII of England immediately saw an opportunity. He wanted Mary to marry his son Edward. The idea was simple. If Mary married Edward, Scotland and England might eventually be joined. But Scottish nobles did not all like this plan. Some feared English domination, others preferred an alliance with France, and Scotland soon became divided. Mary was sent to France for safety. She was raised at the French court. This was an extraordinary environment. She grew up around princes. She learned French. She learned music. She learned courtly manners. She became highly educated. She was tall, elegant, and charismatic, and she was already queen. At 16, she married Francis, the heir to France. At 17, Francis became king. Mary was now Queen of France as well as Queen of Scotland. For a brief moment, her position was extraordinary. She was young, beautiful, rich, and connected to 2 royal dynasties. But the good fortune did not last. Francis was chronically ill. He died in 1560. Mary was 18. Suddenly she was a widow, and she had lost her position at the French court. She returned to Scotland. This was a difficult transition. She had spent most of her childhood in France. Scotland was very different. The country was experiencing the Protestant Reformation. Mary was Catholic. Many of her subjects were now Protestant. The political balance was fragile, and the Queen herself was young. Still, Mary tried to rule. She could be politically flexible. She sometimes tolerated Protestant worship. She negotiated with powerful nobles. She attempted to maintain peace, but the situation remained unstable. Then came her second marriage. Mary married Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Darnley was handsome. He was also ambitious, and he had a strong royal claim of his own. The marriage looked politically useful, but it quickly became unhappy. Darnley wanted power. Mary was reluctant to give it to him. Their relationship deteriorated. And then, in 1566, Mary gave birth to a son, James. This child would later become James VI of Scotland and James I of England. So once again, a royal family was producing a child who would eventually inherit far more than anyone could have imagined. But Mary and Darnley's marriage continued to deteriorate. Darnley became increasingly isolated. He was jealous of Mary's advisors, he was suspicious of her friendships, and he resented the influence of others at court. Then, in February 1567, Darnley was found dead near Edinburgh. The circumstances were suspicious. An explosion had destroyed the building where he had been staying, but Darnley's body showed signs that he may have been strangled. The murder caused enormous political damage to Mary. People began asking whether she had been involved. There was no simple proof that she had ordered the murder, but suspicions spread. And then Mary made another controversial decision. She married James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. Bothwell was widely suspected of involvement in Darnley's murder, so Mary had just lost her husband under mysterious circumstances, and then married one of the men many people believed responsible. This was politically disastrous. Nobles rebelled.
Mary was captured, and she was forced to abdicate. Her infant son became King James VI of Scotland. Mary was now a former queen. She was 24 years old, and her political career seemed finished. But Mary refused to disappear. She escaped from captivity, she gathered supporters, and she attempted to reclaim the throne. Her forces were defeated at the Battle of Langside in 1568. Mary fled south. She crossed into England. She believed her cousin Elizabeth might help her. This was a reasonable hope. Mary was a fellow queen. She was Elizabeth's cousin, and she was in trouble. Unfortunately, Mary had made rather a serious mistake. Elizabeth could not simply allow Mary to enter England and return to Scotland. Mary had a claim to the English throne. Some Catholics considered her the legitimate Queen of England because they rejected Henry VIII's marriage arrangements and Elizabeth's legitimacy. So Mary was not merely a refugee, she was a potential political threat. Elizabeth therefore decided that Mary could not be allowed to leave freely. Mary was placed under guard. At first, the arrangements were relatively comfortable. She lived in castles and manor houses. She had servants. She could receive visitors. She could write letters. She could sew. She could read. She could hunt. She could maintain a household. But she was not free, and that would remain true for nearly 19 years. Mary moved between different residences: Tutbury, Chatsworth, Sheffield, Wingfield, and others. Her captors tried to balance security with dignity. After all, she was still queen, but she was also a prisoner, and everyone knew it. Mary continued to hope for release. She also remained politically active. She communicated with supporters. She received visitors. She corresponded with foreign powers. She was at the centre of several plots. The most famous was the Babington plot of 1586. A group of conspirators planned to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the English throne. Mary's involvement remains a complicated historical question, but her letters were intercepted. The English government used the letters as evidence. Mary was arrested and put on trial. She was accused of conspiring against Elizabeth. She denied involvement in the assassination plan, but the government believed it had enough evidence. Mary was convicted. She was sentenced to death, and now she faced the same terrible transformation that had destroyed so many queens. She was no longer a royal prisoner. She was a condemned queen. Mary was taken to Fotheringhay Castle. On 8th February 1587, she was led into the Great Hall. She wore dark clothing. She had spent nearly 20 years in captivity. She was 44 years old. She removed her outer garments. Underneath, she wore red, the colour associated with martyrdom. She prayed, and she was executed by beheading. Her reign in Scotland had ended almost 20 years earlier. Her political hopes had ended long before, but her story continued, because Mary had a son, James, and James was still alive. This was important, very important. Elizabeth VIII had no surviving children. Mary's son had a strong claim to the English throne, and when Elizabeth died in 1603, James became King of England. The son of the executed Scottish Queen became ruler of both Scotland and England. Mary lost her throne, she lost her freedom, she lost her life, but her dynasty won. This is one of the great ironies of her story. Elizabeth spent nearly 19 years keeping Mary imprisoned. Elizabeth eventually signed Mary's death warrant. Elizabeth died without an heir, and Mary's son inherited her throne. History has a rather dry sense of humour. It does not always give people what they expect. Mary wanted England. She never got it. Her son did. Mary wanted to return to Scotland. She never did. Her son ruled it. Mary wanted freedom. She never regained it. But her descendants gained enormous power. So what happened to Mary after she was overthrown? She became a prisoner. then a political symbol, then a condemned queen, and eventually a royal ancestor. Her story moved beyond her own life, and perhaps that is where we can leave her, not on the scaffold, not in the prison, but with the quiet image of a young Mary arriving in France many decades earlier, a little Scottish queen, surrounded by French courtiers, learning languages, learning music, preparing for a future she could possibly not imagine. She could not know that she would become Queen of France. She could not know that she would lose that crown. She could not know that she would return to Scotland. She could not know that her second marriage would collapse. She could not know that she would become a prisoner in England. And she certainly could not know that her son would one day inherit the throne of the woman who imprisoned her. That is the